And tonight we have coming to speak for us Mr. Joseph Bocca. Mr. Bocca holds a bachelor's from CUNY Queens College in European history, and I believe also a minor in philosophy. Yeah, all right, good, I got that right. Lives out on Long Island. He is a contributor to 1 Peter 5, as well as co-host of the Kennedy Report. And I would ask you all to please welcome warmly Mr. Joseph Bocca.
You all clap so soon as though I'm going to be any good. Thank you for the introduction. So if you're anything like me, you read your way into the church. For me, it was about almost a decade ago, 9 years ago. I've been going to Mass for about 9 years. So it started with my brother going to Mass before me. We used to fight tooth and nail about Catholicism. I wanted nothing to do with it. Then all of a sudden, I go to Suffolk County Community College, and I'm assigned Plato and St. Augustine, and I'm going to Latin Mass ever since. Wow. So yeah, it was particularly the confessions that got me, as it does many. So as he mentioned, I had a minor in philosophy, and that's still one of my interests. I revere it as it did bring me to Christ. So I'm going to start today with a philosopher who is not one of our people, or at least is usually not considered one of our people. He was the self-professed Antichrist, Friedrich Nietzsche. So in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he gave us, as our Lord often does, a parable. This is the parable of the madman. It goes as follows. Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those around did not believe in God, he provoked much laughter. They said, did God get lost? Did he lose his way like a child? Or is he hiding, or is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. Then the madman jumped in their midst and pierced them with his gaze. Whither is God, he cried? I shall tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from the sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They were too silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke, and he went out and he said, I have come too early, he said to them. My time has not yet come yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of man. Close quote. So, we could kind of see why Nietzsche dubbed himself the Antichrist. Because in many ways this is an anti-prophecy, which written in really the early 1900s. Late 1800s, early 1900s is when Nietzsche was living. So we know God, we're all believing Catholics. We know God can't, in a literal way, be dead. His very essence, what God is existence, that in a capital E. So, but what did Nietzsche mean when he pronounced the death of God? What was he referring to? So his reference there was the death of morality and religion in the hearts of man, and not only the hearts of man, but society more broadly. So, what did Nietzsche believe that the religious sense and God would be replaced with? So he, what he wrote would replace God and the religious institutions would be what he called the will to power and the will to dominate. And I think we see this all too much in our society. So, on a somewhat related note, I would like to switch gears a bit to what we see in modern occultism, as a matter of fact. So, there was a fellow named Aleister Crowley. I'm not too sure if you may or may not be familiar with him. His doctrine was that of called thelema, which the Greek means to will, to wish, or to want, something of this sort, right? So we know him basically as being a Satanist, and we could kind of tie his philosophy into Nietzsche's will to power, really. So, and he summed up his, Crowley did, summed up his philosophy kind of in one famous quote. He said, "To do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." So, we'll see how our society here, our modern society, kind of is running on the philosophy of occultism and Satanism and Nietzscheanism in many ways. Although I think, apart from Satanism, I think Nietzsche has a bit more to lend to our society than somebody like Crowley does, but that's another conference, I think. So, where do we see this? Well, to do what thou wilt. Gender ideology, your will, you determine what reality is in that sense, and you could mutilate yourself to change and alter nature the way God made you. Abortion, cities, our city being virtually burned to the ground along with many others. I remember driving into the city, right after, the events concerning Black Lives Matter and these things, and seeing just about every window boarded up. So, there's a lot of negative here. What are the remedies? Well, the remedies are tonight's talk: Fatima and the social kingship of Christ. So, like my favorite philosopher, Socrates, we have to begin by defining what we mean and exactly what the events were of Fatima, what we mean by Christ the King. So, what is Fatima? Where is Fatima? So, Fatima is a city in central Portugal. And at this point, if you even put Fatima into Wikipedia, you see that Fatima is known for being a pilgrim site. So, prior to Our Lady's apparitions, it was basically a place of relative obscurity. Though we could probably get into this in depth, I will probably not. I do find it rather interesting, though, that Fatima is the name of Muhammad's daughter, as a matter of fact. So I do think there's some relation to Islam and the Fatima apparitions. At any rate, we'll begin to cover some of the history. So, first, it all began basically in 1916. So, Lucia, who would be Sister Lucia, and her two cousins, Jacinta and Francisco, were visited by the Angel of Peace. So we, obviously think of Fatima as a Marian apparition, which of course it is. So I think sometimes forgetting that there was, kind of a prelude to Fatima with the Angel of Peace, who they described as having distinguishable features. And the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid," which you hear in Scripture, for instance, at the Annunciation. "I am the Angel of Peace. Pray with me." The angel knelt, bowed its head, and prayed, quote, "My God, I believe, I adore, I hope, and I love thee. I beg pardon for thee, for those who do not believe, do not adore, do not hope, and do not love thee." Then he said to the children, "Pray thus. The hearts of Jesus and Mary are attentive to the voice of your supplications." And with these words, the angel left them. He would appear, we're playing the three of them, and he exclaimed, "What are you doing? Pray, pray incessantly. Offer prayers and sacrifices to the Almighty." And Lucia asked the angel, "How shall we sacrifice ourselves?" and sacrifice going forward is going to be an important theme throughout. The angel replied, "In everything you do, offer a sacrifice to God to make up for the sins by which God is offended. Above all, accept and endure with submission the suffering God will send you." The second time, Francisco had not seen the angel, so it was not visible to him. Lucia and Jacinta are the ones who give him the vision, tell him of the vision. This confuses Francisco because, well, suffering, he is thinking, well, all my earthly needs are met. I have food, I have pretty much everything somebody could want. But I think we see in the life of little Francisco here, kind of a precursor to what Our Lady refers to concerning the devil's final battle being against the family. And I believe the last speaker spoke some about that. So in Francisco's life, for instance, his brother would go on to fight in World War I. His father ended up with a bit of an alcohol problem. And so what you end up seeing basically in his life is, in a very small way, the infringement of a decaying global situation in the West, infringing on the little boy's life, which I think we see more and more of as the elites and things of this sort are trying to get more and more into your life ever more. So, to close out the appearance of the angels, the final visit was in the late summer of 1916, and this time he appeared with a chalice and a bloody host above the chalice, and he gives us a prayer of reparation. Again, reparation is going to be one of these themes that runs throughout the message of Fatima. Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I adore thee profoundly, and I offer to thee the most precious body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, present in all the tabernacles of the world, in reparation for the outrages, sacrileges, and indifferences by which he is offended. By the infinite merits of his most sacred heart and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, I beg of thee the conversion of poor sinners. These prayers, I think, are not often enough talked about. When I was asking for some guidance on how to give this talk from a trusted priest, the Father James Maudsley, he said, "Here, look at these 4 prayers," and I'm thankful for his help. So, on the point of the Eucharist, we're here in a Latin Mass community. We just got done with here seeing Mass, most of us. Most of you know that the Eucharist, being our Lord himself, is deserving of reverence. I think most of us too are aware, or else we probably wouldn't be here, that the Church itself has been quite plagued by liturgical abuse and some hostility towards the Eucharist in some ways. So historically, this probably would have seemed strange, because in 1916 the Tridentine Mass was normative, so that was the rite of the Catholic Church. But we see more and more how these visions give us not only a sign of what is going on at the time, but a sign of what's to come. So, at present then, Pope Benedict XV was the Pope at the time, and he, during his pontificate, begged Mary to, quote, "Look upon the world in tears, to sympathize with the wailing of innocent children, the anguished cries of mothers and wives." So, Pope Benedict was recognizing a phenomenon quite early. Again, the infringement on the family in particular, and wives and mothers, and the attack on children. At the time, gay marriage was not codified in law as it is now. No such thing, transgenderism was not part of the culture in any meaningful way. Neither was abortion, neither was drag queen story hour. We rightly think of it as a saner period. But the groundwork was being laid for the uncrowning of Christ the King. And 2 major blows would be dealt to the sovereignty of our Lord in 1917 and 1918, respectively. Number one was the beginning of the Russian communist revolt in October of 1917, what we know as the October Revolution, right? And number two was the close of the First World War. That was in 1918, which saw the destruction of the old empires, basically the old order, and most notably the betrayal of Blessed Karl of Austria, whose devotion is starting to pick up a lot of steam, as a matter of fact, in our modern time. So we saw his betrayal and the crumbling of the old order, and the old order being replaced by what you might call the new order, secular quote-unquote democracy. So before we get into the contents of the appearances of Our Lady, we should probably parse out what we mean by Christ the King. I think some people are not clear always on what exactly the doctrine entails. Since the revisions in the liturgical calendar and Vatican II, the emphasis on Christ the King and the kingship of Christ has been shifted. So initially, we actually celebrated Christ the King quite recently. It was October 30th. Now, since Paul VI made the changes, it has been moved to January, and as opposed to its adjacency to All Saints' Day. Now, the reason Paul VI gave for this was he wanted to make these changes to emphasize the, quote, eschatological importance of this Sunday. So, we are thinking of, Paul VI has in mind Christ returning, but Pius XI, who writes the encyclical Cross Primas, which institutes this feast day, had this feast day near All Saints' Day for a very particular reason, because Christ the King is not to be thought of as something that is merely a heavenly doctrine, something we associate, well, yeah, Christ is king, but Christ is king of heaven. Here we have secular government, separation of church and state, all this. Not what Pius XI had in mind when he instituted this feast, which was in the December of 1925. So, we could start with a quote. So, Pius XI says, "All men, whether collectively or individually, are under the dominion of Christ. In him is the salvation of the individual. In him is the salvation of society." So, not merely the individual, the society writ large. So, already we have a bit of a sign to be contradicted for our modern man. So, far from being eschatological merely, it shows here that we have to be under the dominion of Christ here in the earthly order as well, the only collectivism that is worth anything. Therefore, I mean, we might hear that there's a situation in which the Pope had said something as though it's illicit to proselytize or convert your fellow man to Christ. This is something that we ought to, at best, ignore, because Pius XI here makes it quite clear that we as a society need Christ. That's the divine commission. So, I think we hear a lot. I think we hear the phrase, "We are to be in the world, but not of the world." So the same is true. We could apply this dictum to Christ the King. So it is to be, yes, in the world. All nations are to be subject to him and to glorify him, but it is not to be of this world. A godly regime is not suited to the end of appeasing man's every appetite or desire, as this would not be in man's best interest. It's not even what man wants. So, we could look again at what Pius XI has to say. He, Christ, is the author of happiness and true prosperity for every man and for every nation. If, therefore, the rulers of nations wish to preserve their authority, to promote and increase their prosperity of their countries, they will not neglect the public duty of reverence and obedience to the rule of Christ. When once men recognize, both in private and public life, that Christ is King, society will at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, well-ordered discipline, peace, and harmony. So, we'll emphasize the first sentence. Our Lord is described as, quote, the author of happiness for every man. So our church, our Catholic Church, is rooted in the intellectual traditions primarily of the Greeks, most especially Aristotle. I prefer Plato, but whatever. And the church is deliberate about the words it chooses, and popes were, I'd say until recently, precise and unambiguous with their wording. So St. Augustine said, sin is its own punishment. Sin is its own punishment. Therefore, the opposite would be true as well. Virtue is its own reward. The two quotes combined give us a good intro into the church's position on ethics. So my philosophically minded listeners might have heard the term eudaimonia. That's eudaimonia, it's a Greek term, which roughly translates to either happiness, flourishing, or well-being. So Stoic tendencies or Buddhist tendencies, while having some of its merits, which kind of emphasizes detaching completely from earthly goods and taking your suffering on the chin and just grinning and bearing it with it, that's really not the Christian ethic. Our suffering is to be transformed in Christ. The Christian life, which does include suffering, we have a crucifix right behind us, no surprise, right? That is truly the good life, the good and happy life. So, look on the world with tears, as Pope Benedict XV said. Well, why? Because collectively, we are refusing the will of Christ and the kingship of Christ. To serve what? As St. Paul said, the world, the flesh, and the devil. And what does this do? Aside from these things be, abortion and gender ideology and whatever it may be, but aside from these things being sins, they also make people miserable. So it's twofold. So that's what the devil does ultimately. Is he places in front of you something that is apparently good and pleasurable, and then you take the bait and the hook is in your lip, and all of a sudden you're miserable. So, before we look to 1917, we should look to another year in history that I think is significant for us in our talk here. That's 1858. So it's 3 years prior to the American Civil War. A few important events happened, and I listed 3. The first was the publication of the essay on liberty by the English utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, which we'll go into a bit. Nietzsche called John Stuart Mill the English dimwit, and I couldn't agree with him more. The second was the publication of, the title is The Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx. And then the third was the apparitions of Our Lady of Lourdes in France, which we probably all know quite well. So our age here, our modern time, is very practical, very economic, very consumerist. This preeminence that we have of man as somewhat of a cog in an economic machine is a product of Marxism, and indeed our quasi-Marxist system that we live under. And frankly, predatory capitalism, which, for those of you that know Marx always understood capitalism to be integral to the ultimate fruition of a Marxist-type utopia. So the capitalism was always seen as a necessary step towards communism. So anybody that really wants you to believe that all we need to do is return to the free market or something of that sort, they're kind of just, they're a little stuck. So this idea was enshrined in Marx's work here, the one we just mentioned. So, I hate to get too bogged down in philosophy. So the joke about philosophy majors, which I wasn't when I was a history major, was that they would ultimately all become baristas at Starbucks or something like that. I'm sure that's true, but my retort for that was always like, well, okay, you may not concern yourself with philosophy, you might be more concerned about your 401k or something like that, but eventually philosophy is going to be concerned with you. And we know that to be true because we all die at some point, which is ultimately a philosophical problem. So Mill, John Stuart Mill. So utilitarian philosophy is, and John Stuart Mill is in many ways the godfather of utilitarian philosophy. What does this all mean? What is utilitarianism anyway? So a short definition for it really is that utilitarianism suggests that our ultimate good, we just went over what our ultimate good is, but Mill and the utilitarian suggest that our ultimate good as people is to maximize the amount of pleasure that can be experienced by the maximum number of people, the maximum number of times. Even to the point where they have something like a pleasure calculus, like, well, they crunch the numbers and like, well, this would give the most number of people the most pleasure, so this is the best. It's an insane ideology. So, liberty, under Mill's definition, was redefined to mean license. So license would be something like like what Crowley said, right? Do what thou wilt, be the whole of the law. Whatever you feel like doing at any given time. That is what Mill understood by liberty. But we could really understand a proper definition of liberty would not be to do what thou wilt, but to do what thou ought to do, right? So, I think it's not, sometimes it's obvious, it would be almost too obvious to point out in what ways pleasure is kind of the ruling principle of society. But we even have alleged conservatives. I couldn't call them conservative in a meaningful way. I mean, somebody like David French, who's a famous writer, and not a self-professed liberal, called drag queen story hours, quote, a blessing of liberty. These are the kind of errors that we're bandying about these days. This is what happens when you uncrown Christ. So what's the answer? Well, what do we do? So the answer appears in 1858 to Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, in which Our Lady says to Saint Bernadette, "I am the Immaculate Conception." So, I am the Immaculate Conception. And what does Christ say? He says, "I am." So that is to say, I am. When Christ says I am, he is I am who is. I am existence itself. I am God. So, in that way, Our Lady was talking about, referring to herself as the Immaculate Conception as being such an important part of her nature, if not completely her nature, to be spotless, to be immaculate. In contrast, in stark contrast to the absolute nonsense that Marx and Mill were writing about in 1858. So, the world had two paths from there. Our Lady, the height of virtue, the only creature ever born without sin. Creature. Second, Marxism and anarchy. Simple. The codification of sin, sin being not only legalized but encouraged, but also tyranny, which we've seen plenty of, and despair, because that's ultimately where sin leads. So, now we could look at 1917. In so many ways, 1917 embodies the culmination of all these things we've just been discussing. So, on May 13th of 1917, Maria Alexandrova was teaching catechism in a church in Moscow, Russia. 200 young children were sitting in the pews under her instruction. There was then a loud noise at the front door. Men entered on horseback, charged down the center aisle of the church. These same men destroyed the communion rail and the altar. And this probably sounds a bit familiar to those of us who grew up, I did not, but to those of us who grew up during Vatican II, the destruction of the communion rail and the altar. They destroyed the statues and even put some of the children to death. This reminded me, when I was reading the story, it reminded me of Christ's words while he was carrying the cross to the women who were crying on his way to Golgotha. Don't weep for me. Weep for your children. Weep for your children. Because those are they are the target. They were the target in 1917, and they're the target now. They're forcing kids to be subject to, like I said, drag queens, allowing them to, elect their gender in public schools. And now, recently it was brought to my attention that the school lunch programs in the Netherlands are testing out bugs as school lunches. They are the ones that they are going after. They hate innocence. They hate innocence because they hate Christ. I recommend reading, if I knew it off the top of my head, I would read it. But I would recommend reading William Blake's poem, The Lamb, to really give you a good idea of what it is they hate. They hate innocence. So, Maria runs out of that church screaming. It was the first of the, remember this is May, it's not October, so this is not the official start of the revolution. It was the first of many sporadic outbursts that would precede the October Revolution. She went up to one of the men and shouted, "The most terrible thing just happened. I was teaching catechism when men rode in on horses, destroyed the church, trampled the children, and killed some of them." The man said in reply, "I know, I sent them." That man was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, he was the prime mover in the communist revolt in Russia. He started it all. Later, the revolutionaries would, in explicit contempt for Christianity, for Catholicism and the faith of the Russian Orthodox in that country, would go on to make, when they imprisoned their Russian Orthodox priests, and I'm sure Catholics as well, when they imprisoned them, they would force them to perform bastardizations of the liturgy. And I won't get into any details of that sort. I do think they're worth knowing, because if you want to know to the extent that these people hated Christianity, there's a good historian, Darryl Cooper, has a podcast called the Martyr Made Podcast, and he does a show called The Anti-Humans, telling of the history of particularly the persecution of the Russian Christians. So that same day, May 13th, we hear from a different Maria. This one is the Maria of Heaven, Our Lady. Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta were attending their flock when they heard the Angelus bell from their parish church. They knelt down, as was their custom, to pray the rosary together. When they finished, they decided to build a little house to shelter themselves on stormy days. Before they could even finish, they saw a flash of lightning across the sky, and yet it was a cloudless day. They began to run, but just 2 paces ahead of them in the foliage of an oak tree, they saw, quote, a beautiful lady. She gestured with maternal kindness at the little children and said, "Fear not, I will do you no harm." again, reminiscent of the angelic salutation in the Bible. Hanging from her right hand, a rosary of brilliant pearls with a silver cross. Lucia then asked where she comes from. Our Lady answered, "I come from heaven." Lucia then asked why Our Lady would come here. And Lucia, bear in mind, she doesn't know that this is Mary at this point. She says, "I have come here to be on the 13th day of each month, at this hour for 6 months in succession. In October, I shall tell you who I am and what I want." Remember, October is the month of where the Russian and Soviet Revolution begins, the communist revolt of Russia, which will be so important for us as a society. Of her 6 appearances, the one on July 13th in the summer stands out. We've already pointed out that at this point, in 1917, we're 1 year away from the end of World War I. Our Lady said, "This war is going to end. If people do what I have told you, many souls will be saved and find peace. But," she added, "if people do not cease to offend God, not much time will elapse. And precisely during the next pontificate, another and more terrible war would commence." It was during that pontificate, which was the aforementioned Pius XI, that the Spanish Civil War took place. So that would have been the what we call the Browns and the Reds, communists versus the quote-unquote fascists. There had been some slandering of who was in many ways a good Spanish leader at the time, Franco. We could rightly see the Spanish Civil War as the prelude to World War II, because in many ways World War I was the prelude to World War II. They're basically one war, if you understand them in totality. This Spanish Civil War saw the death of 13 prelates, bishops of the church, 14,000 priests and religious, and the destruction of 22,000 churches. 22,000. By the Marxist revolutionaries. So we think, well, okay, Francisco Franco's this military leader who seems rather, I don't know, harsh or something of that sort. Well, he was a Catholic, and if you have people, revolutionaries, carrying on that way, it may not be so surprising to be a bit of a reactionary. So, Our Lady then gives the children a sign signifying when such a war will begin. She tells them, "When you see," quote, "when you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, know that it is the signal which God gives you that the chastisement of the world, for its many chastisements, is at hand through war, famine, and persecution of the church and the Holy Father." We ought to remember, we speak of chastisements. So chastisements, we often think of maybe the deluge or something like that, the Noah and his ark and things of this sort, and that was a heck of a chastisement, right? But St. John Hughes tells us that the worst chastisement that God can visit upon a church and its peoples is bad priests. I don't think I have to tell you that we've had our share in our day. We need only to look at the Pennsylvania report and see the horrors of the pedophilia scandal. Aside from just that, the heresies, the schism, one need barely to say allegedly of things like satanic masses being performed by high-ranking clergy in the church. I would point you in the direction of an article in Remnant newspaper by Father Brian Harrison, who digs into this, as well as Malachi Martin's book, Windswept House. So, we even have the admission of Belladonna, to Fulton Sheen. Famously, Fulton Sheen is one of our people, one of our New Yorkers, and one of my people in particular because he was Irish. We know from her that there was an organized and deliberate effort to get believing communists into the seminaries. And she was successful. She was admittedly successful. One could go on and on about how bad priests are a chastisement. I don't think we need to do that too much. All I know is that I have to drive a half hour for Mass every Sunday, which granted isn't long. I know a lot of people drive and travel more than I do, and I'm very blessed. But I just know to get halfway decent liturgy, I have better than halfway decent liturgy, that I need to travel a bit for it. And I'm very grateful for my parish. But under ordinary circumstances, one should not be having to travel for church. You are supposed to be able to just go to your parish church as on any normal Sunday, and it should be the same everywhere. We know for sure that that's not the case. So, what Our Lady does tell Sister Lucia, just Lucia at the time, she wasn't Sister Lucia then, that these chastisements are conditional, despite her also saying that it will be horrible, horrible, twice horrible. She then, famously, goes on to request the consecration of Russia to her Immaculate Heart. Otherwise, quote, Russia will spread her errors, end quote. I would need about an hour or two to get into what the error of Russia might be. I think we've hit some of them already, but we could speculate. I don't know if it's always as simple as Soviet-era communism or something like this. I'm sure it's got something to do with it, though. I've speculated that the error of Russia in particular, to me, appears to be schism. Our Lady of Akita, which is an approved Marian apparition which occurred in Japan, she prophesizes there, quote, cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops opposing bishops. So, the good Father Hardin, you're right, he has a useful little book called, it's actually not that little, it's called the Pocket Catholic Dictionary, very handy. He defines schism as, quote, a willful separation of the unity of the Christian Church. So, it's not merely, although it's necessary but not sufficient to define schism, for instance, as refusal to submit to the Pope. It's part of it. It's not the whole story. Well, we don't really need to look too far to see that schism is manifesting itself within the church, if such a thing could really be possible. Well, where is this occurring? Where is this lack of unity within the Christian church occurring? Well, we can think of the German bishops and their ever-increasing desire to codify homosexuality and homosexual unions for some strange reason. We could think of Germany again. There's a book about what we might call the German problem. It's called The Rhine Flows into the Tiber. The issue of German theology spilling over into Catholicism, into Roman Catholicism. Cardinal Walter Casper was the one ultimately responsible, or ultimately pushing very hard for communion for the divorced and remarried. He got his way. He got his way in Amoris Laetitia, he sure did. It's codified. The Argentinian bishop said that it seems to be that Amoris Laetitia allows for the divorced and remarried Catholics to receive Holy Communion at Mass. Pope Francis attaches that letter to Amoris Laetitia and says, this is the only valid interpretation of Amoris Laetitia. That is sin codified. That is sin made law in the church, if such a thing could be possible. Germany. Nietzsche was German too, and what happens? We have this this German mentality. I mean, it really has its roots in the medieval German, Martin Luther, destroying the sacred priesthood, and basically taking the ideology of do what thou wilt, which of course followed him, you know, I mean, I quote, as well after Luther, and applying it to scripture, religion, theology, interpret it in whatever way you see fit. So why not interpret reality in whatever way you see fit? So that's ultimately what it led to. That is the straight line from communism, from Protestantism to atheism. It necessarily follows. I find it to be a bit funny that there was one of the reformers was a man named Zwingli, and Zwingli did not believe in the real presence in the Eucharist at all. He was a reformer contemporary with Luther. You really have Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, a couple of the main reformers. And Luther said to Zwingli, if you take away the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, you will destroy Christianity. Zwingli intelligently replies to Luther, well, you already did this when you destroyed the sacramental priesthood and the sacerdotal priesthood. The priesthood of the laity and all that was not sufficient for belief in, Luther did not believe in transubstantiation. He believed in something called consubstantiation, but was not sufficient for belief in the real presence. So what do we get in a Pew poll in 2019? I think something like only 60% of Pew-sitting Catholics believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Oh, that's old.
2019.
2019.
Yeah. Confusion hath made its masterpiece, as Shakespeare said in Hamlet. So I'm a traditionalist. I think we need to return to the ancient traditions of the church. Traditionis custodes, which I'm sure, caused a bit of a panic. That is, by Hardin's definition, is in some ways, perhaps not formally, but is in some ways emblematic of the schismatic spirit, you might say. So I think if we don't return to our ancient traditions, our ancient doctrines, we're doomed to a perpetual state of schism. So, the great Russian author is a man named Vladimir Soloviev. He arguably converted from Russian Orthodoxy to Catholicism, but we know for sure he accepted the primacy of the Pope, and he was at least a friend to Catholicism. He wrote of Moscow as being the third Rome. Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy especially, since the crisis in the Church, which does predate Vatican II, by the way. I mean, Vatican II is in many ways the unfortunate events which flowed from Vatican II are in many ways symptomatic of ideological problems that followed prior. One of which is really the heresy of modernism, which Pius X writes about in Pasheni, if you wanted some reading on that. So he writes of Moscow as the third Rome. And since our crisis, Russian Orthodoxy has been picking up converts, and a whole lot of them. We're seeing guys like the internet apologist Jay Dyer filling an intellectual void, and we see the Russian Orthodox and their traditions filling the desire that we have for good liturgy and tradition. Now, what does this come with? Schism. The Russians have a particular contempt for Rome on their Sunday of Orthodoxy. They give a whole list of anathemas. Rome and the Papists are amongst them. They anathematize the Papists every year. So, in one sense, what Soloviev meant by the Third Rome, we could regard as true. He saw Russia as being this big old country between East and West in this odd geographic place. And its geography really is a very important consideration, especially now, as we see things heating up and with concerning Russia and Ukraine. We see Russia's border ever more being encroached upon by NATO. And I will not get too much into the politics of this, but this is one of the big reasons that the Western powers are very much, after agreeing not to, encroaching on Russia's border and interfering with a sovereign nation, one that was absolutely pillaged after World War II. Russia was left in shambles, and the West went in and picked their pocket as much as they could. And now you have the NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? What part of Russia or Ukraine appears to be in the North Atlantic? It seems a bit obvious that the ever-increasing encroachment on Russia has something to do with the fact that they do not. Now, I'm no fan of Putin or anything like this, or Russian Orthodoxy, but for everything they are, they have at least rhetorically been speaking like conservative Christians. They've made the Russian Orthodox Church the state church, and they're not KGB anymore. That is just one of the silly things you hear said about Russia. They're not communists anymore. Far from it. So there seems to be a somewhat concerted effort to push our Western quote-unquote values, which we just went over when we talked about Marx and John Stuart Mill. So there was a lot of talk about, well, Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, well, they destroyed communism. Communism wasn't destroyed. Communism moved. So if you think of, I compare it to the gospel. When Christ exorcises the demons out of the man, the demons don't vanquish. The demons move. They go into the pigs. So communism only went from Russia to the West. And the great Solzhenitsyn knew this. So he wrote the famous 3-volume series, The Gulag Archipelago, right? Which, long and short of Solzhenitsyn was he was imprisoned basically for wrongthink in the Soviet Union. And so he was he was regarded as a loyal son of the Soviet Union. But I think he made one offhand comment and found himself right in the Gulag. He gets out, right? He writes his massive work, and he comes to the United States to give the commencement address at Harvard. When he gives his commencement address, he sees in America, he sees in the United States, which is supposed to be the great enemy of Soviet communism. He says, what I'm seeing, he said, I'm not quoting him directly, but he said, when I came to America, when I came to the West, I was expecting this stark contrast from Soviet communism. And he's like, what I see here is awfully similar to what I left. It was the beginnings of what he left. So, the false understanding of Moscow as the third Rome would be Russia regarding itself, as it often does, as the last bastion of the true faith, and existing in a way to spite Rome. They too have taken a bit of an odd practice, we could call it ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, of rebaptizing Roman Catholic converts, which we hardly even rebaptize Protestants, and yet they're rebaptizing Catholics. And the spirit of schism we could also see again in 2018 the double excommunication of Moscow and Constantinople. Russia excommunicates the Greeks. The Greeks excommunicate the Russians. Is anybody really in the right? Not exactly. However, there's Patriarch Bartholomew. He seems to say an awful lot that is in line with Western values. He speaks a bit like our Pope Francis. Patriarch Kirill, not so much. So, at any rate, you're free to speculate what the errors of Russia is. There was a lot said about Francis's consecration to the Immaculate Heart. I don't think that exactly fulfilled Our Lady's request. That's my opinion on that. Again, free to speculate. So one of my heroes, I mentioned him prior when I mentioned his book, Windswept House, and I won't be, he's a bit of a controversial character. He's Malachi Martin. Spent years in New York. He's an exorcist, an author. He knew the full third secret of Fatima, which we have likely not been given the full thing, virtually certain. He said, quote, "Salvation will come from the east." Eschatologically true. We know Christ is returning from the east. Hence, by the way, one of the many reasons why the priest is supposed to face the altar at Mass. Ad Orientem. The Orient is the east. Perhaps, too, hopefully, it portends to Russia's eventual conversion. Because if you think of this powerful church, this powerful Russian church, becoming Catholic and finally uniting with Rome, genuine unity, would be an amazing force for good. At any rate, the last of Our Lady's revelations took place again in October. The month of the revolution, the month of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? She promised to work a miracle to verify the very things that she said in her appearances. So you see Christ in the Gospels, right? He verifies his teachings with a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms and things of this sort. And so, by October 12th, all the roads to Fatima were packed with carriages, bicycles, pilgrims on their way to see if Mary would make good on her promises. Believers and skeptics alike. And by noon the next day, there would be some 60,000 spectators. And we know this event as the miracle of the sun. It was raining and cloudy, the ground was saturated, and everyone's clothes were wet as they were standing and awaiting the promised miracle. Then, clouds parted, and a transparent veil comes across the sun, making it easy to look at, so you're able to look at the sun. Then the sun begins to spin and dance and twirl in the sky, and begins to look as though it's careening towards the earth. The frightened onlookers, and perhaps believed that this would have been the chastisement that was signified. So here, we can turn back to the beginning of the talk, Nietzsche's parable. Nietzsche, in his prophecy, or his great anti-prophecy is what I usually call it, tells of the earth as being unchained from the sun. And here we saw the sun unchained from the earth, moving backwards, sidewards, and forwards. Is there any up or down left without the church, without Christ, without Our Lady, without virtue? And the answer is no. We see how that is impossible. We see that it has become colder, as Nietzsche said. The warmth of charity has been snuffed out of society. Indeed, Dante in his Divine Comedy in the Inferno, the pit of hell, the last circle of hell it's not hot, it's ice. It's cold, because charity is gone. All right, so what do we do? I'll close with the instructions that Our Lady gave us, because she knows far better than I do, Lord knows. The first, pray the rosary. She gave us two solutions. Pray the rosary. She asked for it every day, 5 decades. 15 if you can. So I'd suggest looking up the promises associated with it. St. Pius X said, if there were 1 million families praying the rosary every day, the entire world would be saved. The other request, make the 5 first Saturdays. I haven't done this yet. You could look up the requirements. It's not all that difficult. And if I could end here with just a short story about one of our favorite Catholic saints, and who I think is quite important for us in our time and for this topic. That is St. Francis of Assisi. So as a young man, he was known for committing the sins of youth, particularly those associated with growing up in a wealthy family, as he did. He did not, prior to living a life of poverty, his family was quite wealthy. One day he went to go pray in a church, a rundown old church, and from the crucifix, Christ said, he had a vision, Christ said, rebuild my church. This rebuild my church had a twofold meaning. The first, rebuild the church you're in. It's important. Charity begins at home. Do what you can, work for the good with those around you in your community, first and foremost with your family, with your friends, with your parish. Then you could rebuild the capital C church and society. That would be, if we follow St. Francis's example there, we could certainly not go wrong. And we have to live in accordance with the motto of the papacy of the good St. Pius X, and that is, restore all things in Christ. That's it, folks. Thank you.
We're going to go to questions, and I would like to stress questions. Let's start with questions. So if people have a comment, let's hold those. Let's see what questions we don't have for our speaker. And I see one right back there. The microphone is coming to you.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. You had mentioned the free markets were not the answer, but as far as I know, they lifted more people out of poverty in free markets, right? So what would you replace that with? Or what is your idea for a better economy?
Well, I'm not an economist, first and foremost, but what I emphasized was predatory capitalism first and foremost. Well, I think you could look up some competing schools of economics. Basically, not to go into a whole thing about this, but capitalism, in the strict sense, Adam Smith's free market, who's the man who basically wrote the book on capitalism, quite literally, does not take into account the doctrine of original sin. So free market, no regulations whatsoever, really. People of their nature are inclined towards sin and really domination. And from there, you see, what do we see in our time now? We see the corporations and things of this sort really being another arm of the government and pushing for the evil nonsense that the government and globalists push. So I suppose the two competing theories you might want to look at, one is distributism, which I don't regard myself as a distributist, but that was Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc's school of thought. Then there's the Austrian economic school, which is another thing you do a bit of digging on. I haven't researched it really at any length, but those would be the areas to look at, say.
Any more questions?
I'd like to ask a question,
Sure.
Mr. Egan.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Bocca. The talk was excellent.
Thank you.
Very good, very well researched. So you mentioned that Stalin and the Bolsheviks, it started there, right? And you mentioned several different areas where the true errors of Russia might lie, and you inferred that it's not, most likely it's not just central or only related to communism, which many I think agree. What do you make of this? There's multiple schools of thought, right? Prudential judgment in traditional Catholicism. What do you make of the school that the errors of Russia are the converged Talmudic Judaism, communism, and Freemasonry that stepped into the void of the deposed monarchies, aristocracies of Catholicism when you mentioned how important was blessed call. And they stepped into the void, and it took 100 years for that hierarchy, which we now call globalism, to rise to power. And there's been many books in different topics and papers and journals written on that topic. Do you have any thoughts that play into that same topic?
Well, yeah, I certainly do. Okay. Communism, Marxism, Talmudic Judaism, and Freemasonry. Do I consider them part of the errors of Russia? Yeah, certainly. It's a very sensitive topic, but if you look to see where some of these revolutions are funded from, some of the actors at play in the major revolutions, you think of the French Revolution as an entirely Masonic revolution, liberty, fraternity, equality. This is as Masonic as it gets. Not to open a can of worms, we see the man that wrote the Novus Ordo Missae. They proved he was a Freemason, so we know that for sure. So we definitely see that, and we know the direction that the church went in regarding the Jews in Nostra Aetate. One might say a bit problematic. Now they're saying that there's no need for them to convert. We know that's not true. And so I think we know who, in a lot of ways, who the liberal elites are bending the knee to, and I think in a lot of ways those three might be maybe spot on.
Thank you for your answer. Do we have any other questions? Follow-up question.
I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you say part of Russia's error was atheism? Did you say that?
I didn't mention it specifically,
but
it's Marxism and atheism are in a lot of ways inseparable. Marx, for instance, talked of religion as the opiate of the masses. So these are godless regimes. So yeah, atheism would definitely be a major part of it. Sure.
And then
if you remember, you're welcome to ask me when.
Okay. Let's give our speaker, Mr. Bocca, a great big round of applause. Thank you.
Hi guys, I have a couple of announcements. I think our Grand Knight, Johnny Egan, who just flew back from Italy, he alluded to a number of different things we have going on in our council. As you know, we've been trying to raise funds with these speaker series with the permission of our pastor, Father Miara. So our March for Life bus is one of those things. This is the 50th coming up, and just because Roe versus Wade is overturned, that doesn't mean it's ended. As you all know, you read the news even more than I do, you know what's going on. So we're gonna host a bus trip, and we'll need to subsidize it, because $50 a person is not gonna get it, to get us there. So I would love to just say, January 20th, 50th March for Life. Ours is one of the few buses that stays for the finale mass, and it's that simple. But as you know, in these days, in 2022, nothing's so simple. So as you know, Cardinal Wilton Gregory has suspended the mass in his whole diocese, the traditional Latin mass. So through the apostolate in Washington, D.C., myself and the traditional mass community there has petitioned Wilton Gregory to let us have the financial mass. He has declined. So we were put in touch with the Franciscan monastery in Washington, D.C., where it is allowed. Unfortunately, they are only allowed, through Wilton Gregory, to have the traditional mass on Sundays. So now we are putting in a new request to see if we can have the mass, the finale mass, the memorial of Nellie Gray, right, which has been going on for many years. She's the March for Life organizer from Long Island, heroic woman. If we can have it at the Franciscan monastery. Of course, the bus will take us, you know, we'll take care of everything with the bus, right? So that's pending, that decision is pending, right? And so we'll let you know. Worst case scenario, Father Chris Salvatore, as you know, he comes on every March for Life bus. He's our chaplain. That's why nothing bad ever happens to us. We always got Father Chris with us. And he just says, Mark, if the worst comes to worst, we're going to have the mass outside. Okay, we'll do it outside. It's going to be real cold. We're going to do it anyway. Same thing happened up at Auriesville. We all went to the pilgrimage, North American Martyr Shrine. Okay, and then they denied us. They denied us for the Coliseum. Not during COVID, but during this. So the priests huddled together and says, what do we do? And they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take everybody, 750 people, and we're going to march down the ravine, and we're going to say the mass over the remains of Rene Goupil outside. And that's exactly what they did. You know, we were there. It was an amazing mass. So we'll probably do something similar for March for Life. If we don't get to Franciscan Monastery, we're going to have the mass outside. The second thing. So the other thing we're raising money for is a Blessed Call Shrine. So originally, we put in the petition for the first class relic, okay, and which was pending, and we're gonna put the shrine here, right on that wall, on this white wall that you see here. But we got further instructions from the apostolate of the Blessed Call Prayer League. It's got to be in the church. Father Miara looked for different places where it could go, and he says, I just don't think this can happen. And then we found a spot that's between the Divine Mercy and Our Lady of Lords. And now he's given us the thumbs up, and we've been pre-approved for the relic. So now the paperwork has to tour Rome, and it's going to take a couple of months, but we're going to have our own first-class relic, and we're going to have our own shrine of Blessed Call. I'm not sure who will say the mass to enshrine that. It would be great if we could get somebody like Bishop Athanasius Schneider here, and our council will work on things like that.
What's the relic? I mean, what part of the body?
What part of the body? I'm not sure, Phyllis, which part of the body of Blessed Call the first class relic will be. Father Chris Salvatore wants one too, for the Pontifical Shrine of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. He's also put in a request. There's a bunch of rules. I'm not going to go into all the rules and regulations, but you know, when he's a blessed, it's different from when he's a saint, when there's a cause. So we have to have a kneeler, there's a book, there's a plaque, there's some different rules. He cannot be depicted with his wife Zita, because she's servant of God. She's not declared venerable yet, so she can't be depicted together yet with her. I mean, most of you already know that the feast day is not on his passing, but it's on their wedding anniversary, right? October 21st, it's on their wedding anniversary. So, and Mr. Bocca mentioned the importance of him. He was the last he was the last capital, Hungarian Austria, capital, Hungarian Empire. Very important saint to us all. So those are some of the new initiatives that we have going on. Next set of speaker series with these priests. I think you all know, because we've had several priests. Their schedules are always changing. So Gene Zanetti spoke here, and everybody loved Gene. His brother is a priest. He was ordained last year in New Jersey. He loves to say the traditional mass. His schedule is fluctuating. We were going to have him next month, but he's going to be the January speaker. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the ex-priests of the Franciscans of the Immaculata, who are chaplains in the Carmelites in the local area in Fairfield and in Emmitsburg, Ellisburg. So Father Maximilian, who they kicked out of the Carmelite in Ellisburg, and now you have Father Johannes. So Father Johannes started a new order, okay? And it's the Franciscans, Mary, Queen of the Apostles. And he was given permission to incarnate in Pennsylvania. And we're going to try to have him come here next month in December and speak. Very powerful, very, Marian maximalism to to the top. And most of you guys know Alexio. He used to serve Mass here. Okay, well, he's now Fra Angelico. He took orders, and we were at his ordination in Pennsylvania. He's a Franciscan friar. This is like the reincarnation of the, if I can use that word, the reinstitution of the Franciscans of the Immaculata, basically. And this is their new order, and they're fantastic, very marrying. And so he'll probably be here giving a speech. And anything else I might have left out, except well, we post the talks, as always. So this excellent talk, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested in, is going to be posted. Colin posted it on his website, and our news blog, which is 9 years going, which is nothing more than a collection of the Monday through Friday traditional Catholic news stories that we put out there, and it unites the communities in the tri-state area. So we have friends mostly in Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, and we have less than 500 subscribers. We put everybody together, and that's how we keep everybody in touch. And the key thing about our news blog is that traditional Catholics emerge. The key thing about our news blog is, number one, we don't monetize, we don't do advertising, and we don't accept donations. It's completely a volunteer effort, and the only thing that keeps us going is prayers. So I thank you all for your prayers. I thank you all for your attendance, and if we could just have a closing prayer, we'll pray for the dead of our past parents and grandparents and our relatives. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancto, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. Let perpetual light shine upon them. And may their souls and all the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Salve Maria.